We're back with another edition of Bad News, the media criticism show the right deserves. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
On today's show, we're going to hone in on something very specific because we think it speaks to an important, broader explanation for media corruption. So, Ben, I know you wanted to talk about Axios AM, which is authored by Mike Allen, the longtime author of Politico's famous or infamous playbook newsletter, which is very popular in the Beltway. It's very popular in all political circles. There's a lot that can be said about these newsletters, but we have on the screen, we'll pull it up in just a second, this morning's edition of Axios AM, and we want to kind of deconstruct it to point out exactly how the ruling class and media elites use their platforms to speak to other media elites and to the ruling class, but as though they are really addressing the entire country. Ben, you want to start walking us through, I'm going to pull it up here, start walking us through this morning's Axios AM?
Yeah, and I think it's important to sort of set the context here, which is I get a few newsletters every morning, probably 50 newsletters in reality every morning, and you have to know what they're saying inside the Beltway to sort of understand the psyche of the people who essentially hate your guts politically and kind of understand how they're framing the issues at play, what issues they select, the ways in which the verbiage that they use to describe them, and also kind of to figure out what are all the points that they're missing or that they're intentionally obfuscating on or not covering. And Axios in particular sort of brands itself as smart brevity. And to be fair to Axios, they do some serious reportage and break some critical news stories as well. So this isn't to bash any one particular brand, but I do think the newsletters are sort of the ruling class speaking to and for the ruling class, instead of, as you said, sort of representing the news for the entire country, even though they create the perception of creating the news for the entire country. And I sort of analogize it to NPR. NPR, they frame stories in a certain way, they pick stories in a certain way. It drives you nuts if you're a conservative to listen to them, but it's important to listen to them to understand both how they're making the sausage and then also what the sausage consists of. And so this newsletter, I thought today was a perfect one because it's talking about sort of, here are the major trends. It's called the mega trends edition that we have to be focused on. And so what are the 4 trends that they talk about? Well, suddenly happy days are here again. We have the biggest economic boom since 1946. We didn't have that boom, by the way, for the last 4 years, but we have it today. Second, once in a lifetime political realignment, but it's not the realignment that you and I might think about and that our viewers would think about in terms of, for example, let's say, I don't know, the Republican Party becoming sort of the populist, blue collar, transitioning away from corporate America and towards middle America, and then the left or the Democrats sort of representing a high-low coalition now of billionaires and intellectual elites on the one hand, and then essentially, the constituencies that Democrats have taken for granted and bought off for decades. That's not the realignment that Axios is talking about here, and we'll get to that in a second. Then their third mega trend is CEO's job now includes political activism. And again, this may be true in the sense of this is the way that corporate America itself is viewing itself, and corporate America is injecting itself into all sorts of issues. But of course, the starting point of this subsection is America's CEOs need policies on the coming verdict in the Minneapolis police trial, human rights dimensions of next year's World Cup in Qatar and Winter Olympics in Beijing, and voting access bills, et cetera. So we can jump into that in a little bit. And then lastly, of course, the fourth biggest megatrend, because this is what everyone was thinking, climate spending is a story of the century. So, we can jump into each of these, but I think it's first important to just look at the framing. We have an economic boom now, didn't have it before, thanks to our savior, the, of course, Biden-Harris administration being in office. We have a realignment that's framed differently from the way that we would frame it, which we'll jump into. We have woke capital and woke capital being urged on essentially by the media to jump in on all these sorts of issues. And why the media says they should jump in is really important, and we'll talk about that. And then, of course, the climate, environmentalism, green energy, and the like. with, the Green New Deal waiting in the wings for us. This is the way that they view the world. And we'll jump in a little bit further to each of these categories to describe sort of the flaws and what they miss when they seek to frame the big issues these ways. But I think this episode will serve as sort of a microcosm, the perfect example, illustration of the chasm between where our ruling class is and where America is. And of course, naturally, this newsletter is sponsored by Facebook. Let's just put that out. Although it says right at the bottom, sponsorship has no influence on editorial content. Of course not.
Well,
with that, let me turn it over to you, Emily, because I'm curious at your initial impressions at how I've kind of framed this and your general take on Axios before we go into the specifics of the newsletter.
There's often stuff that I really like in Axios, and it is a good barometer of sort of the corporate world and the Beltway world and where they collide, sort of the conventional wisdom that's being shared at any given moment. So it's definitely something that I read every morning. We talked about it earlier this week when Mike Allen decided to cover the Ron DeSantis story that was botched by CBS, basically amounts to a hit piece on a powerful governor the meta story that Ron DeSantis is seizing on it as a conservative instead of what he should be covering, which is that a network on an institution of a journalistic institution purportedly of this country ran a completely botched political hit piece on a governor. That's the main story. But of course, they covered it the other way. And that's why these things are sort of important to read, because it's an easier way. It's a quick and efficient way to sort of gauge and assess the state or the temperature of corporate and media conventional wisdom when it comes to politics and when it comes to culture. And that's why this letter is, as you said, this morning's letter is a very good representative sampling. I mean, I think every morning is a good representative sampling, honestly. You mentioned that today's edition was sponsored by Facebook, and then that it says at the bottom of the newsletter that the corporate sponsors have no influence over the news content. That's an important thing, I think, to break down for people, because before I moved to Washington, I would have, easily been like, well, that's BS. Of course, that's nonsense. And it's not, the way that I would explain it is it's not that Facebook is giving Axios any direction. It's that Facebook is sponsoring the Axios newsletter because they know ultimately it's sympathetic, right? So it's not as though like Axios has a lot of corporate sponsors, Google, Facebook, Bank of America, I think, basically banks and tech companies. Why? It's because they're trying to reach their audience, the audience of the people that are looking for Beltway conventional wisdom, et cetera, but also because they just sort of know that these are friendly publications. And again, those publications, Axios will criticize them sometimes. It's not to say that they won't, but it is to say that ultimately there is groupthink, right? Like this is the Hive talking to the Hive and sponsoring the Hive and boosting the Hive. Because at the end of the day, you're not going to have a major sort of question of an existential attack on these companies from Axios or from Politico, right? And so that's the best way I explain it. It's not that Mark Zuckerberg is dictating the content of the newsletters, but it is that there's this sort of assumption of friendliness and ultimately sympathy shared between the two platforms. And that's kind of how it happens. Do you think that's a fair explanation?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. And it also kind of gives the imprimatur of journalistic objectivity and legitimacy to what all the CEOs are going to say at their corporate junkets and beyond. And I sort of view this is sort of setting the narrative that comes out of the mouth of everyone from a Janet Yellen to pick your popular political leader on either side. And so when you see, even on the Republican side, how there's sort of this divide between where voters are and where Republican leaders are, it's because the Republican leaders still live in this world and they absorb the sorts of arguments that come out of newsletters just like these. And so consequently, I think it's really important to know like how this radical 5 to 10% of the country, let's say, thinks about the world, because they have such pervasive influence and disproportionate influence over everyone else. And that's why it's important to know what they're thinking and saying, because they all sort of speak in the same language, frame narratives the same way, glom on to the same stories. And that's the importance of reading stuff that would otherwise make your head spin and turn red in the face. Like, how could they actually believe this stuff?
So what do you think the first bullet point in this 4 megatrends edition says about, to that extent? What do you think when it says biggest boom since 1946? How do you think that fits into the context that we just laid out?
Yeah, so like the first thing to point out about this is, okay, we committed economic suicide essentially for a year. So the obvious thing is, okay, as an economy opens back up, beyond the euphoria of people actually returning to some form of normalcy, there's going to be a surge. It's like when you come out of wartime, there's a surge because you had all these resources diverted or crushed artificially for such a long period of time that of course there's going to be a boom after it. But it's okay, this massive growth potentially, but from what base? So they don't really frame it that way. I mean, they do talk about it to some extent in these bullet points. It says total output shrank so much that there's now an unprecedented amount of slack in the global economy. But they say that the reason, and of course, after the opening paragraph where they say financial titans are coming to a consensus, we're on the verge of a huge boom, they say why it matters. They might be wrong. Okay, that's very insightful there. But all the data point to the same thing. This expansion will be kickstarted by trillions in spending from Presidents Trump and Biden, the Fed's easy, and then they pivot to just Biden later in this. The Fed's easy money and piles of cash that consumers and companies accumulated during the COVID shutdown. Okay, so we may be on the verge of a boom. That may be right. And it may be that artificially low interest rates and money printing and government spending and the like are responsible for this potential boom. But is that a real sustainable boom, or is it artificial if it's because of all this government policy, which is basically taking current taxpayer funds and then mortgaging future taxpayer funds to create this sort of artificial, not actually market-driven boom? They don't really talk about that, I think, because they don't really care about that at the end of the day, because ultimately their consumers of this newsletter are people in the financial services industry who generally love low interest rates and money printing in perpetuity because they are the first people to get access to that capital. They allocate it, and ultimately they don't have to worry until X years down the line when there's a financial crisis as to the consequences of it. But then also the other side of this is, who does end up paying the bill at the end of this? Well, of course, it's going to be we, the taxpayers, whether in tax dollars or in inflated away money that becomes worthless, so our savings get eroded. And this isn't to go down kind of the economics argument rabbit hole, but none of these things are even raised. It's here comes a boom, and it's led by our government, and financial services loves it naturally. And they quote, JP Morgan CEO, Jamie Dimon and the like. But then if you actually read his comment in context where he says this boom could easily run into 2023 because all the spending could extend well into 2023. He also questions, is it sustainable or not? And is it real productivity growth, or is this just funny money chasing after things, creating a boom that isn't really felt by the mass of America? So how do I see this actually? One, at least what a skeptic might say, or what someone might say to balance this is, okay, there may be this growth. At what cost? Who are the beneficiaries of it ultimately? Is it sustainable? And what happens to the broad middle class and the rest of society in context of the boom? None of that is included in this.
I was going to say, this is an important, I guess, point, or sort of, this is an important example of what you're talking about in terms of how the newsletters are saying that they purport to be sort of national coverage or nationally beneficial coverage, but actually it really is just powerful people talking to other powerful people. And again, that's why these things are sponsored by Facebook, because they're targeting their advertisements so that they get this like really nice little blurb about what Facebook is doing disguised to look as a news point, to look like a news point in the Axios newsletter. It's because they're talking to people who take, let's say, Jamie Dimon's word really seriously. And I think, it's, of course, we should all take Jamie Dimon's word seriously because he's the, CEO of JP Morgan and has a lot of influence in the business world. So take it seriously, of course. But, it's always, Jamie Dimon's almost always framed sympathetically by Axios. I think this is actually the second day in a row that Mike Allen is friendly quoting Jamie Dimon as though, in a very friendly and credible way. And it's just to your point, a really, really good example of how it's just powerful people talking to other powerful people, but framing it as though it's sort of like the objective, useful information without a lot of additional perspective. And Axios, by the way, I think Mike Allen does often try to speak to income inequality. I think that was in his newsletter yesterday. And what's so funny is it's how the sort of powerful elite class LARPs as class warriors, right? Like they do really try to have this awareness of income inequality and of class inequality, et cetera, et cetera. They really try. They try so hard. And then the next day you have a little blurb like this. So, it's sort of exactly what you would expect. And I'm glad that you narrowed in on it exactly as you did in detail. We should actually probably move on here to the second point because it's really interesting as well. The once in a lifetime realignment. We're about to be hit with a flood of coverage about the close of President Biden's first 100 days coming up at the end of April. And we have here talking about, this is smart brevity in a nutshell. This is a moment in American history that's unlike any since the transition from the agrarian age to the industrial age in the late 1800s. And just sort of like Jamie Dimon was quoted earlier, here you have a senior advisor, a political director for President Bill Clinton, giving this sort of historical perspective or attempting to give this historical perspective on this moment, saying hilariously, this was my favorite part of the entire newsletter, that the era of big government ended with the Reagan administration. And granted, Ronald Reagan did a lot to try to end big government, but no president alone can deconstruct our behemoth, our federal behemoth. And it's quite a laughable notion that we haven't been living in an era of big government since like 1991. What did you think about this section, Ben?
Well, now we're living in really big government because, as the newsletter tells us, measured by expansion of government reach and spending, Biden's well on his way to transcending FDR and LBJ and transforming America. Okay, that may well be true. The thing that I found interesting here was twofold. First of all, I always recommend go to the source when you see the media talking about a particular source. So the presentation that's actually cited here by this political insider actually has very little about how we're transforming and in some massive realignment. That's one page of like a 20-page deck, which is actually talking about sort of the political state of play generally. And actually is somewhat insightful. It talks about the polarity of our era and how Republicans are primed to potentially take the House in 2022, but here are all the things that Democrats are going to do to combat it, and here are the key players, and on and on. I actually think it's worthwhile read. Of course, he quotes Vladimir Lenin on page 2 of it to talk about the fact that, essentially to paraphrase, that nothing may happen for decades, but then everything happens within weeks. So why he quotes Lenin, I think, is sort of interesting. Of course, omitted in this newsletter. Understandably so.
Philosopher Vladimir Lenin.
Yeah, it's there are some people who like Mao, like Anita Dunn, for example. She liked Mao, so maybe this is sort of the analog there. But I think that the other point worth making here is, of course, what do they hone in on as the first point? In the next 20 years, we're becoming a multiracial society with whites comprising less than 50% of our population. Is that really the defining feature? Mm-hmm. Or is it maybe that like there's an ideological shift that's happening in America? Or if you want to talk about multiracial society, like what about the fact that, of course, Trump had record gains among blacks and Hispanics? Like I wouldn't expect them to say that, obviously, because they would never want to concede that point or focus on it. But race is not the defining issue, ultimately. If we judge people as individuals, it's what do they think about particular issues? And that transcends whatever your skin color is or whatever other traits that have nothing to do with how you view the world consist of. So I just think it's fascinating that, of course, they have to frame this in terms of race as the first thing. Digital, obviously, is the focus of Axios, or a focus, technology and digital revolution and the like. So, of course, you have the myopia of focusing on this as a digital transformation. Again, like all of these issues, they may be legitimate issues, but they omit so much in the way of context. And what they choose to focus on it's sort of self-reinforcing. It's like, this is the way that we view the world. These are the narratives and the lens by which we frame it. And thus, we're going to glom onto anything that confirms our biases. And I think that's what you see in the coverage here of this political realignment. Again, this could have been useful if you said, here's how a Democrat strategist is viewing what's coming ahead in the future. And then also, the chairman of the Republican Study Committee, Jim Banks, just put out a memo where he said Republicans now need to be the working class populist party. And so as you see that there's this huge realignment, here's what Republicans are saying, and here's what a Democrat strategist says. But there's no even-handedness here. There's no even attempt to frame it as sort of balance. Instead, it's multiracial society. We're in a period of turmoil. And of course, half of the country thinks we are changing too fast, while the other half believes we are not changing fast enough. Is that really what the divide is in the country? The speed by which essentially wokeism runs through all of our institutions? I don't really think that anyone sees it that way, but Axios chooses to promote that as a powerful narrative, and you'll probably see that narrative being spun by other people. It's just those bigots who are resistant to change that are the ones stopping the country from achieving its full potential. It's clear what the subtext is for the bullet points, and it's just the ruling class hammering home the ruling class's worldview.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's very much one thing that I like that Mike Allen actually does is try to take the 30,000 foot view, because I think that's something that's missing completely from the media, especially in this era that Mike Allen and his expert accurately identify as one of turmoil, and a lot of that caused by technological upheaval. So I like that. I mean, I think that's great, but at the same time, he does it with this very it reminds me of sort of like Jane Goodall. It's like, this is our very scientific, through the sort of foggy mirror attempt to understand the regulars or the normals,
the anthropological National Geographic look.
100%. It's like this anthropological National Geographic look at America, because to some extent they know they're out of touch, and they're sort of they're just at this point pretend they've given up all efforts to actually really not be out of touch and to change their ideology. They've just decided to accept and embrace, and then treat everyone else sort of like apes or gorillas at the zoo, that they're in the jungle trying to understand their behavior from this very clinical and scientific perspective that really lacks a lot of dimensions and lacks a lot of depth. So no, I think your analysis of this is really spot on. It's just the way that the corporate media not even corporate media, the corporate America and the corporate media just sort of have this almost patronizing, I guess I would say. I find this kind of patronizing, and it doesn't have to be, because it's Mike, you're a regular guy too, you live in this country. You don't have to feel so distanced. There are other things you can do. You don't have to text Jamie Dimon all day and include things in your newsletter from him. You're also part of this country, but it's very patronizing. And I think that's something that you see a lot in newsletters like these. The third bullet point is similar in that, all right, CEO job now includes political activism. This is something, again, that Mike Allen covers all of the time in his newsletter, just sort of running themes, income inequality, climate, CEO activism. But I actually really think, and Jamie Dimon, of course, this is really similar to what Jamie Dimon has said over the years. This blurb in Mike Allen's newsletter sounds like it was ripped from one of Jamie Dimon's memos that he sends around. And it's really funny how closely it mirrors it, but it's also a good example of how they just sort of use perception to create reality, right? Mike Allen thinks this is what companies should be doing. He notices the trend. He thinks it's great. Starts covering a lot. And suddenly it becomes the dogma of corporate America. This is what people do in C-suites. Now, because Mike Allen pushed it so much, is he created the trend. He willed it into existence by treating it as something that was a trend when it was bubbling up. And I actually really think a lot of coverage of CEO activism that looks just like this bullet point in the letter really created that reality. It was something that just sort of pushed it into existence by treating it as something that was much bigger than it actually was. We see this all of the time with the corporate media, but on this particular issue, hammering in on CEO activism, that really is what created the pressure on CEOs to become activists, because the corporate media was telling them their shareholders wanted them to become activists. And I don't think that was broadly true, but I think it is now, partially because of coverage like this.
You hit the nail on the head. The media willed this into existence along with left-wing agitators, essentially. And so consequently, as you said, rightly so, the perception has become the reality, at least among Fortune 500 executives in this country. Of course, there's no question posed of like, is it a good thing that corporations are inserting themselves into every political issue? And of course, it's only on one side and in one direction. Like, is that a healthy thing for our society when you're going to have civil society essentially self-segregating on the basis of ideology, and ultimately then you're going to have consumers and people choosing to work on the basis of what the political ideology is of the executives within the companies? Is this a healthy thing for a country? Of course, they would never delve into that sort of nuance and like, okay, what are the actual substantive takeaways for the American people as a consequence of this? No, it's America's CEOs need policies on all of these particular issues. They just have to inject themselves into politics. And you know, so I think, to my mind, this is a valuable point, and that this really is how, you know, our benighted corporate executives are starting to view the world. It's what our media has been ginning up and pushing for years. So I think it is valuable to that extent. But I think the most important bullet in the whole thing is the last one. It says, what's next? There's one issue where CEOs still want to defer to Washington: China. Top execs tell me confronting Beijing on human rights is too fraught and costly of an issue for global companies to take the lead, i.e. corporations are cowards when it comes to actually putting their money where their mouth is with respect to their purported activism. And this is all for show. And as I've argued here and elsewhere, here's the reality. If you wanted to cover this in a real journalistic way, or at least a critical way, or looking at the other side of it, here's the question you have to pose. Do corporate executives actually believe in what they're promoting when it doesn't really cost them anything, even though it might be alienating 50% of the country? Or is it all about the bottom line, trying to essentially pay for protection from the woke mob, being cowards in the face of that mob, which is representative of a really small percentage of the country, or cynically thinking that they can pay it off and go along with it so that they don't have to pay the price for the sin of being successful in a relatively free market economy? That might be another way to frame it. I would not expect Axios to frame it that way. I wouldn't expect really anyone in the corporate media to frame it that way. But the fact that they have to raise the hypocrisy of China at the end, but they do it in such a way that, well, executives are really looking for leadership from Washington in this issue, is just so perfect. It so perfectly crystallizes their mindset and the hypocrisy and how phony it all is.
Yeah, they want to punt now, right? Like, they're going to be activists everywhere else, and Mike Allen's going to cheerlead that. But when it comes to China, they're going to punt. And again, this is another great example of why companies like Facebook sponsor these newsletters, because this is something that people in the journalistic class should be absolutely like just champing at the bit to lay into corporations for doing. And here we have a newsletter that communicates, you know, with the ruling class, but again, with the framing and the pretense that it's more broad, just totally allowing them to punt on China. I mean, this is where you dig your teeth in as a journalist. This is where you take that bite and you're like, my gosh, these people are incredible hypocrites. But I mean, that's something that would be really upsetting. I mean, you can lose every corporate sponsor by doing that because they're really sensitive on these issues when it comes to China. And so, yeah, you're going to have problems with your corporate sponsors when it comes to that. And that's why you see this very gentle framing that lets these companies off the hook for doing some really, really bad things. I believe this newsletter has been sponsored by Amazon in the recent past as well. And so that's this is just apart from like the language that you highlighted and articulated perfectly well why it's problematic and why it's totally using this overly gentle framing on a very serious issue, while also sort of cheerleading the activism when it comes to the United States. And this, by the way, this is another tangent, but that's why you see Disney, you know, saying we're not going to be able to film in the state of Georgia if it passes this pro-life legislation, while filming it literally in Xinjiang. Like, they're filming in like
they're in a gulag, literally filming.
Yeah, and thanking the entities that have been implicated in human rights abuses in the credits of the film, while they're saying we can't film in Georgia because of this pro-life legislation. Oh my gosh. Like, this is why you see all of it, is because the corporate media isn't in a position to be hypercritical. Because guess what? Who owns ABC? It's Disney, right? Like, it's just, they're all in it. They're all implicated in these things, and they all rely on places like China for sources of money, places like Qatar, which was raised in this newsletter, this blurb in the newsletter as well, in reference to the World Cup. So that's why you get this like gentle framing, and it does really have consequences. It's, you know, how you get away with, as, you know, the government being too soft on China for years. It's how the Obama administration got away with it. And there are really serious consequences to that, allowing China to sort of calcify into this authoritarian state without doing everything we could to stop it reasonably. And that's a problem. So there are real world consequences to it. But I love how you zeroed in on this in particular, because that is so perfect. There was one other thing that I saw too that I was like, holy smokes. I think it was, okay, I lost it. But it's again, well, here's another Business Roundtable that was run previously by Jamie Dimon when they started this entire theme of that. And this is like Mike Allen picked up on it almost immediately. And so again, it's just a great illustration of how they were super excited to talk about activism because it sort of was on cultural issues. And we've talked about this before. People who demand activism from corporations in the media only want it on cultural issues. They don't want activism in terms of saying, hey, Jeff Bezos, your net worth increased by $70 billion over the course of the pandemic. Maybe the activism you should do is pay your workers more, right? Like maybe you should have safer factories, whatever it is, use that money for good. Maybe, do X, Y, and Z. No, it's just activism in terms of we really need you to posture on Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, it's all part of the social justice shakedown that they're all in on. And meanwhile, of course, like they support the anti-capitalists and they've benefited from relative capitalism. We could go on the hypocrisy of it. The last point in the newsletter, and it's the one we should spend the least time on, but it's like obligatory that they have to have the green energy one, which is another self-fulfilling prophecy. Like if they say that the world's going to end every 10 years and they can use that to justify massive redistribution of wealth or creating all these sort of industries that would have never cropped up in a natural state of an economy. And oh, by the way, screw over those who work in traditional energy parts of the economy and the like, they're all for it. The great reset that's been talked about over the last year, energy, environmentalism is of course a huge part of it. So this is just like, they have to have that little environmentalism bullet just built in there out of virtue signaling for one thing. And then also because this really is going to be big money for all the people in the ruling class. But meanwhile, it's the coal miner in West Virginia who of course is going to pay the price of it and the consequences of it. There's probably an element too of like sticking it to big oil companies that are, I guess, perceived as aligning more with Republicans than Democrats. So you have that aspect of it as well. But I just think it's of course, the science is settled on climate change, global warming. First it was global cooling, then it was global warming, then it was climate change, then climate disruption, and God knows what it'll be called tomorrow. But there's not even a questioning of like, should we be having this massive shift in energy when the greatest boon that we've ever had in the last decade, let's say, is fracking to everyone in this country and beyond in the Western world, and like America being not reliant on the Middle East anymore for energy supply. Like these are massive shifts. There's no focus at all on that broader context. It's we have an industrial green revolution coming, and that's just the way of the world, and that's how it's going to be. So to me, this is just sort of lacking in all self-awareness, obligatory virtue signaling over the green energy stuff, but it's content free and substance free, except for the fact that, again, who stands to benefit from this? And we can't have any question about, like, are we going to be a nation of Solyndras after this?
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, that's another really good point. And let's look again at this language. The successful global effort to slash carbon emissions demands unprecedented investment. So he's using language that it's so meta, right? Like he's saying it demands. Well, who's demanding it? Why is it being demanded? It's being demanded because you say it's being demanded. But what you're trying to do is create the reality, or create this alternative reality for other people in the elite class that this demand exists. So just because you say the demand exists, what you're really saying is, I think it demands. But you're phrasing it as it objectively demands. And that actually sounds like splitting hairs, but when you use that language over and over and over again on every single issue, like CEO activism, for instance, you could say, and I'm sure he has said in the past, racial turmoil demands corporate CEO activism. Then as a CEO at a company who reads this newsletter and takes it seriously as sort of the temperature in Washington, D.C., you're like, holy smokes, this climate demands demands my action. And you start to take it a lot more seriously. You think that the impetus is much stronger than it actually is because other powerful people who you text with, as Jamie Dimon, whoever it is, are saying that. And so it's just the hive mind creating the reality that it wants and using their power to create the reality that they want without fully realizing that they're doing it because they are out of touch. And then B, without anybody else being able to speak up and say, what the hell are you talking about? And I just think a broader point, by the way, to make about all of this as we're wrapping up is look, for instance, at who was cited in that last blurb. John Kerry. You just made an interesting point that there's nothing here about becoming a nation of Solyndras. And this is really important because in almost every single bullet point, you have a leftist expert cited credulously, right? This is credibly. So you have this credible citation of John Kerry without a credible citation of anybody else, a credible citation of Jamie Dimon without anybody else, a credible citation of a Clinton advisor without anybody else. Every single bullet point is being supported by the argumentation of an expert that is from the left, and then advanced as the objective sort of read of the situation. And again, this is a newsletter for corporatists, written by corporatists, or sponsored by corporatists and written for corporatists. And so that's what the powerful people then are saying is objective truth. And this is the objective read on the situation. And it's just literally all perspectives from liberals, from neoliberals is probably the best way to say it. At bullet point after bullet point, John Kerry, Jamie Dimon, Clinton advisor, time after time, it's saying, here are the experts that you should listen to. They're all cultural leftists. They're all neoliberals. And it's another great way to build your reality and to will it into existence.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. And that's why I thought that this newsletter, it's just so perfect. And we should probably do a running series of these. Every day I I don't know why I still subscribe to it, but I guess just for laughs at this point, the Washington Post editorial page, they send out their kind of headlines and how they're framing. And it's so far beyond parody. Axios gives the appearance of being buttoned up and serious and thoughtful and rigorous, but short and pithy and to the point. The Washington Post op-ed page is beyond anything that you've ever seen. I mean, it's really indistinguishable sometimes from pick your left-wing publication from the 60s or 70s. But that said, this is important, I think, because this is the way that our elites speak. It's what they think about. They all read from the exact same script. And these are the people who have disproportionate sway over society. So it's really critical to understand, again, sort of how the sausage is made and then what the substance of the sausage is. And so, we're a media criticism show. We're just trying to provide balance to it and say, look, this is how you should question. Here's how you would poke holes in it. Axios, if they were smart, maybe they'd have an ombudsman who would come and be kind of the counter voice to their newsletter and say, here are the other alternatives. But they would never do that because the ruling class wouldn't like that. So it would have to be a controlled opposition sort of ombudsman put in place. But I just think it's useful sometimes to step away from this and get untethered from the news cycle and look at what are the broader trends that they are willing into existence, because this is what's going to come down the pipeline. So it's good to get ahead of it.
Yeah, they fake it until they make it, right? They fake reality, treat it as reality until it becomes reality. And these newsletters, I think, are a very big part of that by sort of advancing conventional wisdom and the conventional ideology of the Beltway neoliberal class. That's how they create it. And of course, part of the problem is that they don't really create it entirely. They create it among the sort of echo chamber that they're speaking to. And that's what causes so much division. As the Clinton advisor / historian advanced in one of the bullet points, you have half the country who thinks we're not moving fast enough, we're not changing fast enough, and half the country that thinks we're changing way too quick. Well, guess what causes that tension or exacerbates that tension? It's the echo chamber demanding the rest of the country move much, much faster when the rest of the country has no voice and no way to really They saw Donald Trump as their voice. They elected him to the highest office in the country over Hillary Clinton for a very, I think, obvious sort of underlying reason about elitism and the political establishment. And the political establishment takes the opposite lesson that they should have from all of it and piles on him and treats the his entire voter base as deplorables, to borrow a word from everybody's favorite Secretary of State. And that's how you end up in this situation. And it's just the lack of awareness is really amazing. But these newsletters, I think this was actually really a useful sort of annotation here. These newsletters are a great window into the Beltway conventional wisdom. And the lesson that I think we tried to impart from all of this is that it's a total echo chamber. And that's why you see corporate sponsors for it. That's why you see corporate executives being quoted credibly without any like real pushback. And you see them treating China and climate in the way that they did. Any final thoughts on this, Ben?
Oh, well, so, yeah. So, I mean, I could go on at length about the China and climate thing and the irony, of course, that these are the same people who we need to go back into the Paris Climate Accord, which China is going to cheat on. And China is, of course, the polluter par excellence in the world. But, there are a million instances of hypocrisy in here. Now, I think you crystallized it quite nicely. And my final point is it's important to read the sources from the people that hate you, but that are powerful, to understand their thought process and then figure out how you can actually combat it.
That is so true. Well, this has been another edition of Bad News. We're here every Wednesday. We're here every Friday around 10:30. We're on all of the Federalist social media platforms. We come to you, at least I come to you, from the National Journalism Center here at Young America's Foundation's headquarters. And we are the media criticism show the right deserves. We really appreciate you watching and tuning in. We hope you'll continue to tune in and keep watching. We think this is a really valuable project and we appreciate your time. Until next time, I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
See you soon.